Hello, everybody. Greetings from Ankara, the capital of Turkey, to all professors, scholars, and students who are watching us. This is the second episode of our Orientalism webinar series organized by the Social Sciences University of Ankara, Turkey, or ASBÜ as we say it in Turkish. I am Filiz Baran-Akman, Associate Professor of English Language and Literature. I am also the Vice and Acting Chair of English Language and Literature Department. Now, before we start, I would like to give you brief information about our series. Orientalism webinar series is a series of online lectures, each of which will host a world-famous distinguished speaker on a related field with Orientalism and postcolonialism. In each webinar session, a speaker will give a 30-40-minute talk on a topic about their scholarship, followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. During the talk, please send your questions to asbuo@gmail.com. So this is asbuows.gmail.com. All right. In our series, our aim is to give you an opportunity to students and scholars from around the world to become familiar with the trailblazing and cutting-edge scholarship of internationally acclaimed academics on critical theories of Orientalism and postcolonialism. Related issues to be discussed include the image of the other, namely the East, Islam and the Turks in Western discourse, and Islamophobia, cross-cultural interactions and encounters between East and West in the historical context of the Renaissance and beyond, as well as pedagogical issues and topics related to these fields of study. With the gracious contributions of these important scholars, we hope to inspire more emerging students and scholars to see the rich possibilities of potential research topics in these significant area studies with necessary updates. It is an absolute honor and privilege for me to introduce to you today's speaker, my own teacher, Professor Ronald Strickland from Michigan Technical University. His talk is titled The Global Anglophone Literature Curriculum. Ron Strickland is Professor of Literature and former Humanities Department Chair at Michigan Technological University. He is the author and editor of numerous essays, collections, and journal issues on pedagogical and curricular issues in literary and cultural studies, and on the institutional and cultural politics of the humanities in higher education. He is also the creator of more than 100 YouTube lectures on topics in literature and cultural theory. He co-edited with Christopher Newfield the collection After Political Correctness, the Humanities and Society in the 1990s. And he also edited Growing Up Postmodern, Neoliberalism and the War on the Young. He was the founding co-editor also with Christopher Newfield of Meditations, the journal of the Marxist Literary Group. In 2018, he was the guest editor of a special issue of the journal Humanities entitled Saving the Humanities from the Neoliberal University. He formerly taught at Illinois State University, where in 2005, he co-directed with Ron Fortune a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on teaching Shakespeare with textual variants. He has a wide range of international experience as a scholar, teacher, and administrator. In 1996, he was a participant in a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on Literature and the Modern Experience in Africa at the University of Ghana. His publications have appeared in journals published in Asia and Europe, as well as the United States. He has been a Fulbright Senior Scholar at Moldova State University in Chisinau and a visiting professor of English literature at Srirakarinvirot, I hope I read this correctly, University in Bangkok. As an administrator, he has established cooperative agreements for academic exchange and recruitment of students with universities in Cameroon, China, Chile, France, Germany, Ghana, Thailand, and Uruguay. As a result of his direct outreach efforts, dozens of students from these countries have pursued postgraduate studies in the United States, and several American students have had postgraduate internships abroad. Before I leave the floor to the professor, I would like to relate a personal anecdote very much related to the topic of today's lecture. This anecdote, I should say, played a decisive role in forming the path of my future studies in English literature. Almost 15 years ago, so you are going to, guess my age, by the way. Beyazıt, my husband, also my colleague, and I started our MA studies in Illinois State University as two young Fulbrighters to the US. We had the great luck to take a graduate class titled 16th and 17th Centuries British Literature with the professor, in which we studied a canonical work of English literature, Milton's Paradise Lost. Though the work was a canon, the way we approached it was not. In our readings, we not only looked at the works from a cultural studies viewpoint with a focus on class and historical context, but also had interesting discussions in which we talked about the allusions to Islam and the Ottoman Sultan and the Turks in this text. That moment onwards, we realized that there is a fresher perspective to adopt for our careers, which would eventually introduce us to the works of Edward Said, Orientalism, and postcolonial studies. Professor, now maybe you will not even remember this anecdote, but we are so grateful to you for leading us towards this end. So today it's an exceptional honor for me as a student of you to welcome you and have you as a speaker in our Orientalism webinar series. Once more, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your time and expertise and scholarship, Professor. Now the floor, but I should say the screen is all yours, Professor.
Thank you, Felice, and thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. How could I forget? Of course, I remember your contributions to that course, even though it was some years ago. Those things stay with me in my memory because it's such a rewarding experience to have encounters with students from whom one will learn so much. Thanks also to Beyazıt and everyone else involved in organizing these sessions and for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here. So let me see if I can load my PowerPoint and begin. Let's see here. Okay. Felice, I can't see my picture. Is that good? Okay. So I'll start. I'm going to read my paper, and I hope that's not inconvenient for anyone. It will keep me on task. In the early 1990s, after visiting several universities in the Persian Gulf region, Edward Said described an ambivalent situation. On the one hand, more students were studying English than any other subject, but the demand for English studies was prompted by purely instrumental goals. Said writes, many students proposed to end up working for airlines or banks in which English was the world lingua franca, end quote. This pragmatic vocational motive for English studies, he concludes, all but terminally consigned English to the level of a technical language, stripped of expressive and aesthetic characteristics, and denuded of any critical or self-conscious dimension. Well, I want to begin by adding some historical context to Said's remark about the lack of expressive and aesthetic characteristics and the lack of a critical or self-conscious dimension in what we might call neoliberal literary studies. Throughout the 20th century, literary studies helped to prepare growing numbers of citizens for democratic participation in the public sphere of the modern nation state. In the latter half of the century, literary studies became closely linked with feminism, anti-racist and post-colonial politics, and other progressive modes of critique. But in the current moment of neoliberal globalization, all of these progressive dimensions of literary studies are being undermined, partly a symptom of the postmodern redundancy of those modern nationalist projects, and partly a symptom of the neoliberal imperative to subject all areas of social experience to the logic of the marketplace. Nonetheless, neoliberal vocationalism also brings us a broader audience of students, a student cohort that reaches beyond the ostensibly avocational and nationalistic boundaries of traditional literary studies. My suggestion here will be that we should embrace, or at least accept, neoliberalism's vocational imperative and seize the opportunity provided by the transnational scope of neoliberalism to engage all of our students in the kind of expressive, aesthetic, and self-consciously critical experience that Edward Said found lacking in his observation above. The question is, how do we do that? One place to begin is with the curriculum, and I'll suggest some specific guidelines for rethinking nationalist literature curricula in a few minutes. But first, I want to establish the nexus among neoliberalism, vocationalism, nationalism, transnationalism, and literary studies. In various ways, economic globalization has weakened the nation state as a framework for democratic agency, as national structures are subordinated to the needs of corporate business. For example, late capitalism depends upon the control of labor migration regulated by the borders of nation states. But this is not merely a matter of sealing off borders. It means restricting migration of workers in some cases and encouraging migration in others. In some instances, global capital takes advantage of local constraints on wages and working conditions to suppress labor costs. In other instances, highly educated workers are encouraged to migrate, causing brain drain problems in developing economies and yielding a windfall benefit to developed economies that underinvest in their own educational systems. What's consistent in all of this is that the system privileges property rights over human rights and capital development over human development. And in many cases, capital development, transnational capital development, even over national development. Neoliberal vocationalism in higher education poses challenges to traditional literary studies, but neoliberalism and globalization depend upon some version of literary studies as preparation for jobs that require high levels of critical awareness, communicative competence, and some kind of cosmopolitan perspective. That cosmopolitan perspective is a critical discursive site for intervention. So let me elaborate it before I go on. The term cosmopolitanism may evoke associations of elitist and Eurocentric traditions, but scholars like Gerard Delanty have argued for a new cosmopolitanism from below, or a critical cosmopolitanism in non-elitist and non-Eurocentric terms. Delanty elaborates 4 dimensions of critical cosmopolitanism. First, cultural difference and pluralization are seen as positive ideals. Second, centers of authority and power are dispersed. Third, borders are blurred by new transportation and communication technology. And fourth, political community is reinvented on a global scale. At its best, critical cosmopolitanism promotes the ideals of civic humanism that higher education traditionally promoted at the national level. It promotes democratic agency in a post-national world. I didn't mean to do that. Let's see. Critical cosmopolitanism can be nurtured by a global Anglophone literary studies that relates local and national culture to transnational context without subsuming the local under the global. Just as critical cosmopolitanism rejects elitist and Eurocentric associations, I also want to distinguish it from a neoliberal version that I would call corporate cosmopolitanism. Corporate cosmopolitanism represents a set of experiences and values shared by the professional managerial class of workers involved in transnational business. This corporate cosmopolitanism may be globally aware and more or less non-Eurocentric, but it has no particular stake in egalitarianism or democracy. So these two demands of neoliberal higher education, the vocational imperative and the cosmopolitan imperative, offer sites of intervention. What is needed is a kind of Anglophone literary studies that could nurture a democracy of the multitude, as envisioned by Antonio Negri and Michael Hart. A democracy of the multitude would be based on a citizenship of the global common that confers the right to work anywhere, to live anywhere, to work as creatively and productively as one's capacities allow. A democracy of the multitude is imaginable and possible, Negri and Hart write, only because we all share and participate in the common. These terms describing a global common that could serve as a foundation for the political empowerment of a transnational multitude correlate closely to those skills and attributes that global business seeks to develop in students. So global capitalism itself provides the opening for a new kind of democratic political empowerment, even as it tends to overwhelm existing structures of democratic power. In this historical moment, we can develop a global Anglophone literary studies as a framework for civic humanist agency that, like global capitalism, selectively deploys, but is not bound by ideologies of nationalism and institutional structures of the nation state.
Professor, as you have just paused here, can I suggest you do something? If it is going to be easy for you, could you please share your, PowerPoint with us, if it is okay? We can take the time to fix this because we cannot see as viewers the PowerPoint.
Yes, of course. Of course. Thank you.
You are welcome. Just take your time to to fix this. Then we will continue with your lecture.
My sincere apologies.
Oh, no, you are welcome. Sorry, it was actually on my part because I didn't, notify you that we actually cannot see it. Thank you, Professor. Now we can see everything.
Okay.
All right.
Very good. Okay. Well, the traditional civic humanist role of literary studies in modern universities is indebted to two important concepts that I associate with the thought of Immanuel Kant, and hence specifically with the inception of the epoch of modernity. One of these is derived from Kant's notion of the aesthetic, as described in his Critique of Judgment. For Kant, aesthetic judgment is a spontaneous recognition of that which is agreeable and beautiful, the sublime good that will evoke universal and necessary assent among right-minded members of a community. Traditional literary studies aim to nurture and cultivate this sensibility among students, notwithstanding the irony implied in a spontaneous recognition that must be taught as a discipline. The other concept, drawn from Kant's Conflict of the Faculties, is the idea of the university as an institution in the service of the nation state, but which at the same time must retain some degree of autonomy from direct governmental control in order to perform that service. That is, modern democracy requires, and I would add, robust capitalism also requires a safe space within the social order for scientific, political, cultural, and economic experimentation and innovation outside of direct governmental control. As many scholars have pointed out, this study of literature in schools and universities dates only from the 19th century. It's often associated with the fear expressed by Matthew Arnold that in modern society, the ideological power of the church could no longer guarantee the conservative values necessary to maintain social order. In studying English literature, it was hoped the masses would gain enough appreciation for traditional values to prevent society from devolving into chaos. But according to Gauri Viswanathan, this strategy actually originated in British India as a provision for native education of subaltern functionaries in the East India Company's Charter Act of 1813. You may recall that Dr. Bill Ashcroft mentioned the East India Company's Charter Act in his talk last week. During the 20th century in Great Britain and the United States, growing numbers of students from the middle class and working class families attended universities, and literary studies performed both the ideological and the practical functions of preparing them for citizenship and careers. Meanwhile, as English became the global lingua franca of science and business, universities around the world adopted curricula and textbooks from English and American publishers. So students of English literature in Africa, Asia, and South America study some version of the Anglo-American canon, as determined by the mostly British and American university professors who edit the textbooks. When, in the aftermath of independence, the Kenyan writer and scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o argued for the abolition of the English department at the University of Nairobi, his logic was absolutely compelling. Why should university students in the newly independent nation state of Kenya continue to study the national literature of their former colonizer, Great Britain, rather than to cultivate their own national literature in their own indigenous languages? Ngugi was right to recognize that the development of an aesthetic sensibility in an atmosphere that is relatively autonomous and relatively free from direct external political control is a core function of literary studies. Still, from our current vantage point, and perhaps even from the perspective of 1970s realpolitik, Ngugi's logic was self-defeating. His argument was embedded in the logic of high modernity, the logic of discrete nation states and national cultures, the logic of a moment before the postmodern advances in transportation and communication made the world a smaller place. In the 1970s, it may have been possible to imagine that some nations could navigate the currents of the bipolar Cold War so that their national cultures might be protected from outside influence. But in the post-Cold War age of cell phones and social media, we can no longer close our borders. And globalization doesn't disappear when we close our eyes. It's necessary to engage the metropole. It's not possible to ignore it. A global Anglophone literature curriculum must be transnational, and it must disrupt the unquestioned centrality of Anglo-American literature. Of course, this project is already well underway. In response to the challenges of postmodern theory, identity politics, and globalization, the Anglo-American literary curriculum has been supplemented by writings from post-colonial, subaltern, and non-Western writers. Writing on the burden of English in a post-colonial setting, Gayatri Spivak has suggested that English literature should be taught in such a way that it is, quote, intimately yoked to the teaching of the literary cultural production of the mother tongues, end quote. The strategy is interliterary as opposed to comparative, she says. And quote again, in the presence of long established institutional divides and examination requirements, it's important to see the alien text of the metropole and the familiar text of the mother tongue, each as a product of an epistemic system. and to stage collisions, for example, between writers like Kipling and Tagore. She goes on to write, nonetheless, it would constitute a self-defeating retreat from globalization simply to replace the Anglo-American canon with a logic or with a local or a subaltern literary canon. As she stated emphatically on another occasion, and I'll quote a longer passage here, unfortunately, material reasons, as well as a not unconnected devotion to English have produced a lowering of interest in the production and consumption of work in the regional languages of India. On the other hand, I think we cannot undermine our current excellence in the study of English, throw away something that we have developed over the last few centuries because of this situation. The real solution would be to find ways of supporting a comparative literature of Indian languages rather than jettison the exquisite literature of global English today. Well, in today's job market, according to Bruna Martinuzzi, who is a business writer, writing in a 2013 post on American Express's internet forum, she writes, English majors are the hot new hires. English majors, she argues, are highly sought employees because English majors excel in 4 specific skills. They have oral communication skills, they have writing skills, researching skills, and critical thinking skills. These are familiar vocationally oriented goals of English studies. But then Martinuzzi adds to these skills a distinctively avocational attribute of the English major, empathy, citing a study showing that frequent readers of fiction have higher levels of cognitive empathy, or the ability to understand how another person feels. Martinuzzi concludes that when you hire an English major, you're likely hiring someone who brings cognitive empathy to the table. Well, reducing the cultivation of empathy through English studies to such specifically practical and instrumental and commercial terms may strike the humanist reader as a rude violation of the uneasy compromise between vocational and aesthetic goals of English studies. Still, even a backhanded compliment is welcome. Is it the case that unavoidably, along with skills of oral communication, writing, researching, and critical thinking, literature students will develop heightened capacities for empathy? Is this a potential threat to the vocational imperative of neoliberal higher education? Empathy, she writes, is the oil that makes the machine of business run smoothly. Is empathy such a threat that business interests need to contain it by claiming empathy as their own agenda, by guiding the empathy in a certain direction? Terry Eagleton once observed that modernist literary studies taught students to be, quote, sensitive, receptive, imaginative, and so on, about nothing in particular, end quote. Martinuzzi would probably approve of this function, but her attempt to claim cognitive empathy for vocational ends is a signal that literary studies can be a site for democratic agency against the grain and from within the structures of neoliberal globalization. Literature, as I'm using the term here, is a distinctively modern phenomenon. And every society that participates in economic globalization has some relation to the experience of modernity. Therefore, a self-conscious recognition of the role of literary text and literary studies in modernity should be able to provide a broad framework for a literary curriculum not bound by criteria such as nationality of authors or presumed aesthetic value abstracted from political and historical considerations. Consider, from a generic perspective, the novel is a specifically modern art form. Novels are made possible by the material conditions and mode of social organization of modernity. They require mass literacy, industrial production and distribution of printed text, and typically urban bourgeois reading audiences. Novels also engage some of the recurring issues of subject formation in modernity. For example, psychological novels develop interiorization as an art form and portray typically modern struggles such as alienation and isolation. The Bildungsroman, or novel of the formation of a young person, is an invention of modernity that resonates across different cultures. But it's not a typical form of artistic expression or concern in pre-modern narrative. Issues of subject formation, class consciousness, race, and gender identity are modern themes, as are narratives of colonial encounters and anti-colonial struggle. And yet, consider the novels listed on this slide. 14 novels on the current syllabus for the Indian Civil Service exam. The list is divided into two categories, before and after 1900. All of the authors are British, except for Mark Twain, V.S. Naipaul, and Raja Rao. It's a good list. It's probably effective. It's probably an effective tool for sorting out applicants for civil service careers. But it's exactly the kind of Eurocentric, traditional, nationalistic canon that I've been arguing against. If we seek to prepare students for global citizenship in the 21st century, we can do better than this. The point is simply that the work studied should be in dialogue with each other, as Gayatri Spivak said, in the context of a community that is not bound by traditional hierarchy of center and periphery. I think that community is emerging as a consequence of economic globalization, and I think it will have to flourish if global capitalism continues to evolve. Economic globalization is producing a community of educated, cosmopolitan subjects who might become citizens of a global democratic political order, the multitude of Negri and Hart. In the global cosmopolitan bourgeoisie, one finds a ready-made transnational community, but that population is formed by a global capitalist order that has no articulated stake in democracy. If this community is to become a force for expanding human liberation, it will have to develop a vision that goes beyond the traditional nationalist cultural boundaries of modernity. Ironically, as a practical matter, the consumerist character of the global Anglophone professional managerial class provides a foundation for building a global Anglophone literature curriculum. Given the problems of teaching literature in a post-literate epoch, in which reading for pleasure is no longer widespread and valorized, an effective canon would prominently consist of works of recognized literary merit that have already been adapted into films and other digital formats for wide global distribution. Such works are already transnational and already have demonstrated relevance to popular audiences. There's some danger that such an approach would lapse into a consumerist popularity contest of lowest common denominator standards. But this tendency would be mitigated by the inevitable inclusion of existing canonical works from the Anglo-American, post-colonial, and non-Western Anglophone traditions that have been adapted for broad distribution through film and other media forms. So, down to the choice of text. At this point, it will be useful to present some tentative examples. What comes quickly to mind are the literary texts written from the periphery that intersect with canonical metropolitan texts. Examples would include Jean Rhys' The Wide Sargasso Sea, which can be read as a post-colonial response to Charlotte Bronson's Jane Eyre, or Aimé Césaire's A Tempest, which demands to be read as an anti-colonialist riposte to Shakespeare's The Tempest. These texts have become so prominent in their own right that by now it seems almost irresponsible to teach Jane Eyre or Shakespeare's The Tempest without reference to Ries or Césaire. But strategically, some works don't travel as well as others, and this has nothing to do with literary quality. Consider, for example, two novels that are widely taught in English literature courses around the world: Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I have to wonder what kind of meaning is made from the requirement of reading Huckleberry Finn on the English language section of the Indian Civil Service examination. Huckleberry Finn is one of the pillars of the American literary canon. The book has lasting popularity, and it has a formative influence on subsequent American literature. It treats the theme of racism, a socio-political issue that threads through American history from the colonial era to the present day. Furthermore, the text is a model Bildungsroman, and it's recognized for its achievement of formal stylistic innovation, for its liberal use of slang, and for its first-person limited perspective narration by a child protagonist. For all of these reasons, it would seem to be an obvious choice for inclusion in a literature curriculum. But on the other hand, the book's centrality to the American experience comes at the expense of making it less accessible to an international audience. The colloquial style is difficult. The theme of late 19th century American racism is distinct enough that it doesn't automatically resonate with readers from other cultures. And while there have been film adaptations of the book, none of these have gained critical favor or widespread popular success. In fact, the book is rather difficult to teach outside of the United States, and increasingly difficult as time goes on to teach within the United States. So despite its obvious importance in the history of American literature, Huckleberry Finn might be better left out of a global Anglophone literature curriculum, or at least left for advanced students. Now, let me contrast the choice of Huckleberry Finn with another novel from roughly the same historical moment, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which shares much in common with Huckleberry Finn. Structurally, both novels employ the narrative of adventure as a plot device, even to the point of featuring river voyages prominently. Both novels develop an ironic critique of modern society through the perspective of an ostensibly naive narrator. Both novels invoke the tradition of Bildungsroman. Although Marlowe, the protagonist of Heart of Darkness, is no longer young, the novel documents his loss of innocence as he encounters the corrupt ethics of the modern business world. Thematically, both novels treat the issue of racism, though neither text is as much concerned with the liberation and/or fair treatment and understanding of Black people as it is with a critique of the cancerous effects of racism on European and American societies. But Huckleberry Finn treats the issue from a narrow, distinctly American perspective, while Heart of Darkness embeds it in the context of capitalism and colonialism, both of which are more central issues than race in the novel. Heart of Darkness threads the analysis of acquisitive territorial expansion, conquest, exploitation, colonialism, and capitalism over 2 millennia, to ancient Rome's conquest of Britain, then across geographical space from England to Belgium, along the coast of North Africa, and finally to the Congo. So if I were considering which of these two novels to include in a curriculum or on a syllabus for global Anglophone literature, based on thematic considerations, my choice would be Heart of Darkness, simply because it has a more global, cosmopolitan frame of reference. But aside from thematic considerations, I would also take into account practical considerations, such as access and currency. Here again, Heart of Darkness has an edge. Twain's use of colloquial slang in Huckleberry Finn was an important aesthetic innovation, and it is powerfully effective as a formal strategy in the novel. But the colloquial dialogue makes the novel difficult to read even for contemporary American students, and no doubt much more difficult for non-Americans. So again, with its elegant standard English prose, Heart of Darkness has an edge. But by access and currency, I mean something more than how easy it is to decode literary prose. It's more important that a prior awareness of the text is relatively widespread. This may be manifest through film adaptations, for example, but also through the text's influence upon or participation in a cultural meme that has wide global currency. Although Huckleberry Finn has been adapted on film, the adaptations have not been notable and have not had wide distribution. Heart of Darkness, on the other hand, was adapted as the basis for one of the most widely acclaimed films of the 20th century, Apocalypse Now. This gives the novel greater potential currency among a transnational audience, and the fact that Apocalypse Now relocates the narrative from European intrusion into Africa to American intrusion into Southeast Asia actually enhances this aspect of the discursive ensemble with which to engage our students. Critical controversy can also factor into the decision which texts will be most relevant for a global Anglophone literature curriculum. In this comparison, both of these texts have been the subject of controversy around the issue of racism. I'll pause here from my prepared text just to say that controversy, as I'm thinking of it, is quite often a good thing, a productive dimension of literary studies. Well, Huckleberry Finn has been banned from inclusion in many high schools in the United States because of its inclusion of a racial slur. On the other hand, Heart of Darkness was the subject of a landmark anti-racist critique by the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. Whether or not we agree with Achebe's critique, it opens a dialogue that expands the transnational and transhistorical reach of Heart of Darkness. Well, much more could be said about these examples and about other similar pairings and ensembles. My point here is not to make a definitive claim about canonical boundaries, but to suggest the kinds of premises and questions that should guide the development of a global Anglophone literary studies. With this implicit claim to represent, in Matthew Arnold's words, the best which has been thought and said, and its structural division into chronological periods, the traditional Anglo-American curriculum evades questions of power and affirms the imbalance between so-called mainstream and marginal texts. By contrast, the global Anglophone literary studies should disrupt this residual power imbalance and reject its implicit claim to self-evident status. And that's my conclusion. Thank you.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for this informative and eye-opening lecture with very tangible examples, actually. Now, we have received many questions from the audience as well. I have tried to put them together, so came up with two questions. So I would like to go ahead and ask the first question to you. So these questions are in fact sort of like related to each other. The first one is more about culture specific to the Turkish context. So I would like to start with this question. So you say in your lecture, a global Anglophone literature curriculum must be transnational and it must disrupt the unquestioned centrality of Anglo-American literature. And then you give the tangible examples of Heart of Darkness versus Huckleberry Finn. And, my question would be, in what ways do you think we can make these selections more culture specific? For instance, in the case of Turkish culture, would the area of comparative literature be an answer to this? Or simply how can we accomplish this? So sort of we would like to hear your suggestions on this.
Thank you, Felice. Well, to begin, remember Gayatri Spivak suggested interliterary as opposed to comparative couplings or pairings of literary text. And the distinction, as I understand that she's making there, is that the interliterary strategy recognizes that each text is a product of a particular epistemic system. And so it isn't that there is one epistemic system that is universal Some texts are ranked more highly on a hierarchy than other texts as more important, but that each text is the product of a larger social formation, a larger social context, a larger epistemic system. And if any society that is any economy, any nation state that's participating in the global economic order cannot completely resist cultural influence from the global metropole. But on the other hand, the global metropole will be affected by encounters and the increasing diversification of cultures in which all of us come into contact, with which all of us come into contact in this historical moment. So the point is not to completely worry about, in my view, the point is not completely to worry about protecting a local culture when we're teaching our students. Those local cultures are resilient and they can take care of themselves to a large extent. The point is to value, to valorize, to honor the local culture in its interaction and engagement with the metropolitan text, the metropolitan culture. Both will be changed. Both will be changed by the participation of the wider audience. So something is always lost. I can't deny that in this kind of cultural encounter, but it's all will not be lost. And an example, I've taught in Thailand, for example, which is another nation state that never was technically conquered by a Western power, but which has been much influenced by its encounter with the Western metropole, and yet has retained its national identity very strongly as part of that engagement. And I think Turkey's another good example of that. So I think my suggestion is to boldly face those controversies, those encounters, those difficulties with students, and to trust the local culture, to trust the student, to critically analyze and compare, and to produce some fusion of these different epistemic systems that will come from the encounter. And by the way, I'll just add that this doesn't, one thing that this means is, in my practice, I practice, is you will be engaging metropolitan texts that are very unfriendly to the local culture, that may be clear examples of cultural imperialism. And I think it's counterproductive not to engage those texts, even if they may be painful to read or annoying or may raise anger among readers. They may be embarrassing to the esteemed metropolitan authors or the cultures from which they come. That's okay. It's all part of our history, and it's what makes it interesting.
Yeah, I think this is a legitimate point that you are making. By the way, before I continue, could you please close the PowerPoint screen so that the viewers can also see me while talking?
Yeah. Of course. Let's see. Is it closed now?
Close the PowerPoint, then everybody is going to be able to see me as well, because right now they are seeing you and then the PowerPoint presentation. Yeah,
okay.
they should be able to see me as well. All right.
Good.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, going back to the answer that you have just given and the idea. Actually, first of all, what I would like to say is, you have given us a lot to think about, and these issues that you have been talking about and touching upon with your, very informative lecture with very tangible examples is of great relevance and importance to us as well, because these are some of the issues that we are sort of like trying to think about, ponder upon, and find solutions to. And one of the things that you have just suggested, sometimes, the text that is coming from the Western sources about the Turks, about Islam might be offending. And this is okay. And this is what I say as well. And this is why, for instance, I make my students read Othello, Shakespeare's Othello, because there are this demeaning depictions of the Turk as the turbaned, circumcised dog. But that's okay, because this is what they need to be realizing and reading. By the way, Shakespeare produces this beautiful artwork. So this is another dimension, because you have been talking about the aesthetics and two different things to think about, like in terms of literature, other cultural and historical context is another dimension to think about. And in relation to this, like the idea of the other would be the additional thing that we need to think about. So these are, some interesting, suggestions and viewpoints that you have made us to think about. The other questions that I had actually was sort of like relevant to this one. So I'm just gonna skip this one, all right, if that's okay with you, because you have already talked about this. Actually, the other one, if you want me to read this to you, it's more about this, more generic in a sense, because you have talked about these two important, terminologies and concepts related to your lecture. One of them is critical cosmopolitanism, and then you have this, local identity. So you have said this kind of critical cosmopolitanism can advance democratic agency in a post-national world order, and it can be nurtured by a global anglophone literary studies that systematically relates local and national cultures to transnational context without subsuming the local under the global. So this is an important point that you are making here. So maybe as a last, thing, you would maybe, we can ask your further thoughts on this issue, expanding on this issue. So the question would be, how can we strike this delicate balance? Because there is this delicate balance that we have to observe here, balance between nurturing critical cosmopolitanism and preserving local and national identity through teaching of literature.
Well, the short answer is that it's important for the local faculty preparing a curriculum or the local instructor preparing a syllabus not to lose sight of the real goal of the study. And if I go back to that Indian civil service exam, for example, as an example, there's a curriculum, a very metropolitan curriculum, a very kind of traditional British literature curriculum of really great works of literature. But their importance is kind of abstracted from the needs of readers and students at the current moment in the context of the purposes of progressive agency, teaching for democracy, teaching students, preparing students for the globalized neoliberal world that they will be entering into in the workplace. And so that kind of an exam focused on those particular novels, you can sort out which students are clever, which students have good recall and good reading skills and so on. And those students will function well, I'm sure, as civil servants within a national bureaucracy. But that's not the goal I want. That's at least not the only goal that I want to set for my students in my class. I want students to be empowered with greater democratic agency and that democratic agency at the current moment is increasingly in the polity of an emerging global order rather than merely the local national order. So I guess it's important for scholars and teachers to not lose sight of the real basic goal of what we're about. And this may mean, by the way, that you have to do some work to develop some materials, to develop some approaches that are not evident, not obvious, and not already kind of implied by the textbooks and our past curricula, or a curriculum that one might borrow from one of the metropolitan systems. It means developing a lot of one's own approaches and materials.
Yes, and this sort of like requires a little bit of experience in the teaching, like with this comparative mind, and with an eye on the international, and then an eye on the local as well. All right, Professor, thanks for the answers. And once again, thank you so much for this informative, eye-opening, and very relevant a lecture with very tangible examples to think about. And actually, it is, for myself, it has been a pleasure to listen to your lecture after such a long time. Thank you. Thank you again.
You're welcome. It's been a great honor for me and a pleasure. Thank you for these.
Okay.
Thanks
to everyone.
Professor,
and bye.
Bye.